Welcome to Lost in the Supermarket. Today, a very important discussion about health, about fitness, and what we need to be doing. My guest is Nora Minno, an award-winning registered dietitian and certified personal trainer based in New York City. Over the past 10 years, Nora has built a reputation in the fitness and nutrition space as a credible expert developing communications and marketing strategies for top consumer packaged goods companies, professional sports teams, global health apps, and leading healthcare groups. Her work, her writing, and her advice have been featured in national outlets including The Today Show, Women's Health, Health Magazine, and Well Plus Good, and she appears on a regular basis as a trainer on Daily Burn's Emmy-nominated show, DB365. Nora, welcome to Lost in the Supermarket.
Thanks for having me, Phil.
So, first up, I guess, you're going to tell me that I really need to get more fitness in and exercise and stuff like that, but we're not going to go there.
We're not going to go there.
We're not going to go there. So, a couple of weeks ago, President Biden, convened a group at the White House to talk about the term healthy, to talk about how we need to change, maybe put front of pack labeling on products, whether it's stars, whether it's traffic lights, and so on. Give us your opinion. Is this good? And do we finally have some kind of definition for the word healthy?
Well, listen, I think, and I always say this, that nutrition it's never good, it's never bad. It's a gray area, which frustrates a lot of people because yes, in an ideal world, we could put a red, a yellow, a green light on a package, and miraculously folks would start making healthy choices and everybody would be fit and healthy and disease would be gone, right? Like that's the ideal world, but we know it's much more complicated than that. We've seen programs like this in the past. Some may be more successful than others. For example, calorie labels on meals at restaurants, we know actually do have somewhat of an impact on consumers' choices when they are eating at that restaurant. But that's one meal out of their week. What are they doing? The other 6 days a week and the other 3 meals a day. Yes, I think there's some good that can come out of this. My hope is that it brings more awareness to consumers' purchasing decisions. But we just know from some historical data that when it comes to reading labels and paying attention to the call outs on pack shots, about 50% of consumers are actually paying attention. And I imagine it's 50% that are maybe a bit more educated or actually care a bit more. So, I like to be an optimist here. And I think any attention on good nutrition and healthy choices is a positive. But I think we'll just kind of have to wait and see because, as I said, nutrition is very gray.
So, you bring up a really good point that 50% of the people who are reading labels probably don't need to be reading the labels,
Sure.
and the other 50% are ignoring them. Typically, they fall into that bucket where the disease states like diabetes and heart disease and so on are probably at a higher incidence. So how do we get to them? I mean, what responsibility does a brand, does a supermarket have to really help them to eat healthier? Or are we overstepping our bounds and should we just let people eat whatever they want to eat?
Right. I think it gets complicated. And we know that folks who just want to eat what they want to eat are going to do so. And like I said, nutrition is complicated. Behavior change is very complicated. And that takes a lot of work from an individual, typically with a professional. So I think if we kind of bucket this into two sectors, okay, the government side of it, and then kind of the private sector being the supermarket, when it comes to the government side, intervention much earlier on in terms of health education, nutrition education in public schools and much wider programs. We see programs like WIC and things like that are quite effective, but they're just kind of far and few between, particularly kind of in public schools and public education. But then when we look at the supermarket, I think, what we're seeing happen with registered dietitians becoming more readily available and more employed by supermarkets is a great resource because they're there if folks want to engage with them on a more kind of personal level, and they're there to help provide some guidance and kind of excite people about food, which I think is awesome. But I think, when it comes to supermarkets, they're there to really just provide the choices and, like I said, excite people about food, which I love to do as well. But we can't always limit what's offered there, because then that just gets into a whole nother conversation. But yeah, so I think there's two ways to look at it: what's happening on the government side, and then what's happening kind of on the private sector side.
What do you say to people that say, eating healthy is too expensive?
I My whole philosophy as a dietitian is that food, and eating healthy should not be expensive, stressful, or time consuming. And so I've kind of built a career, and sometimes it doesn't get the sexiest headlines, right? No fad diets, nothing crazy, but just sticking to basic fruits, vegetables, things like that. And that's where I do start to get concerned about adding more labels and classifying food in other ways, because that can create a lot of stress around food choices. When it can be kind of quite simple: find foods that you enjoy, eat when you're hungry, don't eat when you're not, focus on fresh, focus on whole. It sounds like super simple, but it kind of is in that degree, going back to basics there. And you look at foods, especially, we know, plant forward diet or a heavily plant based diet, there's loads of research showing how important that is for prevention of disease and long term health. And you can buy a can of beans for 75 cents, and that's, 2 to 3 protein portions for a day. So it really doesn't have to be as expensive. I think where we start to see the prices getting jacked up is these kind of fancier brands doing all of these, more exotic ingredients, or starting to slap more of these labels on the front of the pack, because once you have more of these labels, you could charge more for it, right? Because it's more exclusive. So I'm very strongly and firmly against the argument that healthy food has to cost more.
During the beginning of the pandemic, certainly there were a lot of articles written about people just wanted to eat comfort foods. So
Yep.
we saw a lot of cookies, sales go up, a lot of candy sales go up, a lot of what I'll call junk food,
Sure.
really being consumed. Has that waned as the pandemic is decreasing, or did people get into bad habits and they're keeping them?
That's a great question, and some more research I think to be done there, because we're still slowly coming out of that really intense period of the pandemic. I think I definitely contributed to some of those cookie sales. But what I think is quite interesting is that during the pandemic, folks started turning to brands and products that they trusted and felt more familiar with. And I just took a look at the International Food Information Council 2022 study on kind of just food and health and wellness. And a lot of those patterns of kind of choosing brands that are more familiar have stuck around. So that's something interesting to note, I think. And, an important thing to call out about nutrition is, if we're kind of putting our cellular metabolism hat on, it's very basic at the surface level, right? You eat a carbohydrate and it gets digested and break it down to glucose and your blood sugar, or your insulin. You could go through kind of everything that happens throughout the digestive process. But we can't always forget the emotional aspect of food and the well being. So there are those times where a cookie can help you kind of downregulate your stress and your emotions and provide you that little bit of comfort. And that's great, or provide you that bit of pleasure. And that's great. But kind of, you made an interesting point. Like, are those habits, do those linger, and do people start to kind of take something that could be a good habit for maybe managing stress, and then that starts to kind of turn a little bit into maybe a habit that we've built that we don't want to last long term, or it can start to snowball into other things. So that's an interesting point you raise, and it really goes back to just individuals continually to be aware, of their body and their choices. So it's just constant practice of awareness and mindfulness when it comes to food choices.
So, Nora, look into your crystal ball, and what does American health and fitness and food look like in 5 years from now?
Wow, Phil, that's a great question. There's I can answer that two ways, what I hope it will look like and what I think it will look like. I don't know if they fully align. I think, or I hope that we continue to kind of just get back to basics again. I think in the past couple of years we've gotten so caught up in, is it organic? Is it gluten free? Is it keto? Is it this? We've gotten so caught up in that exclusivity of nutrition. What's food is not. And I would love for folks just to start to focus on what food is. And it's a lot of things. It's nutrition, it is social, it's celebration, it's spiritual, it's all of these things. So I'm hoping that we can get back to a point where we're focusing on what food is. Um, I don't see kind of cooking and things like that at home, enjoying meals slowing down anytime soon, which excites me as well. I think folks might be ready to take that into their own hands a bit more than maybe meal kits and things like that. Personally, I feel like those have had their day and kind of saturated a bit at this point. But I think I hope at least that folks will really get their hands on their own food and continue to cook at home and get back to basics, like I said.
You bring up a really good point that probably for the past decade, we've looked at foods as what it's not.
Hmm.
And I think that that's a really interesting and insightful observation. So we've gone to the avoiding of certain ingredients, avoiding of certain nutrients, and so on. How do we turn that around? How do we do exactly what you said? Focus on what food is,
Hmm.
versus, oh, we can't do that, so we're going to run down the aisle and look for something else.
Sure. I think the responsibility to make that shift can be put on every individual, starting even kind of every group, I guess, involved in this process, starting from the brands that are producing food and the way that they market and the claims that they are seeking to put on packages. When we start to get conditioned to things like keto and paleo or gluten free this or that, like absolutely that has a place because that can be helpful for some folks that are actually need that for whatever reason, medical reasons or allergies, even just preferences. But just in how we market and the products that we're putting forth and kind of the message that it conveys, even into the advertising, like what kind of messages are we sending with the advertising and how we're putting products forward. I think another group that this responsibility falls on is health professionals, right? It's easy for us, and this has been always a challenge in my career of not getting caught up in newer trends or fads or things and having to kind of dig my heels down into the ground, even at times where it might not have propelled my career forward, but I've kind of stuck with what the science says and what I believe to be true as a dietitian from my own experience of working with individuals. So for us to kind of just stay grounded and focus on food from a place of abundance rather than restriction. And then even on the individual side, I think you know removing jargon from just vocabulary that can kind of perpetuate some of these fad diets or kind of even just binge and restrict cycles that particularly we hear in women's conversation and other conversation like, oh, that's a little fat, or I didn't eat, oh, I can't have the ice cream today, oh my gosh, just that type of language that we're all kind of contributing to. I think really plays a role in all of it. So I think everybody has a role to play, and I hope that we continue to kind of move forward and realizing that food is connected to our well-being rather than just our weight and health and disease states. It's connected to our emotional, our spiritual, and our physical well-being. So I hope that's a direction it continues to trend in. Especially, could have mentioned this before, but as our society, in particular in America, we're more focused on self-care and emotional healing and just being more present and being more in control of that aspect of our lives. I hope that food can start to align with that a little bit more and be part of people's kind of healing and just self-care journeys.
So, Nora, what keeps you up at night? What are you worried about as it relates to, food and fitness and our overall health
Mm.
for Americans?
That's a great question, Phil. What keeps me up at night, I guess, would be just the increasing gap um, in terms of access to food and just not even access, but just, I'm trying to find the right way to say this. Um, just the growing divide between access to both information and food. Um, you know, for one thing, we could teach nutrition in public schools, but if those ingredients aren't readily available in certain neighborhoods, and if individuals don't have the resources or the tools to make those, and that becomes increasingly difficult to kind of close the gap, particularly for those in more low income areas or don't have the resources that other individuals in different neighborhoods or different income populations might have. And it goes beyond that. It's just, the need for parents to continue to work, more jobs. And so they can't be home to make a meal and have mealtime. So it's just that kind of growing divide that keeps me up at night, because if the parents can't be involved in child's kind of nutrition journey, they're the ones grocery shopping and preparing, and it kind of, the cycle starts all over again, if you will. So that would be the one thing that keeps me up at night, and just ensuring that you know all populations have access to nutritious and affordable food.
Nora, as always, great insights, great commentary about where we are now and where we need to be going. Thanks so much for joining us today on Lost in the Supermarket.
Thanks, Phil. Thanks for having me.